Zaproszę teraz pana profesora Petera Niekampa. Pan profesor jest wybitnym specjalistą z zakresu ekonomii przestrzennej i regionalnej. Jest profesorem ekonomii regionalnej i geografii ekonomicznej na Universiteit w Amsterdamie i to, co jest bardzo ważne, myślę, dla nas wszystkich, należy do grupy 50 najbardziej czy najczęściej cytowanych autorów spośród wszystkich naukowców na świecie, wszystkich dyscyplin. Mamy tą okazję dzisiaj pana profesora wysłuchać. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, Mr. Vice Rector, Mr. Vice Marshal. Ladies and gentlemen, what an absolute delight to be here in one of these intellectual centers of Poland, and I'm very pleased to see this whole aula full of people interested in the topics we have to discuss today. I will take you quickly through a whole series of slides in a minute, but before starting I would like to make a few introductory remarks. And first I will start with a personal observation. I would like to pass on to you the greetings from the Netherlands. This week is for our country a very special week. It is exactly 70 years ago, second part of September 1944, when the liberation of the Netherlands at the end of the Second World War started. And it was a joint effort of American troops, Canadian troops and Polish troops. And this week we have a whole ceremony for the whole week to celebrate this, and on various occasions on the television, in the newspapers, etc., always the contribution of Polish soldiers who have really contributed to the liberation of the Netherlands is explicitly recognized. Some of you will know this as the Operation Market Garden, and others of you may have seen the movie One Bridge Too Far, but this all centers about this issue, which is celebrated for the whole week in the Netherlands, and I just would like to mention this point at this moment. Sometimes when I teach to my students, and I ask students in my class, Dutch students, who of you would like to become an entrepreneur? Well, maybe 5 raise their hands, but not entirely sure, but not that many. If I teach the same class in the United States, and if I ask American students, who of you would like to become an entrepreneur? At least 50% raises their hand and say, well, yes, we want to become an entrepreneur. Apparently, there is a big cultural difference between the attitude of European students and American students. And I'm sure Zbigniew Bognias, who is with us and is also based in Seattle, Washington, United States, will have the same observation. So that's where Europe may have a problem compared to other nations in the world. And somehow we have to address these issues. We have to establish and reinforce the links between academia, entrepreneurship, and also public policy, so as to create a much more of a support system which would help us. That also has led to a situation where successful entrepreneurship in the United States is highly recognized. All of us know Silicon Valley, the Silicon Valley phenomenon. All of us know the North Carolina Triangle. All of us know the Boston area. But only a few of us maybe know Sophia Antipolis in Europe, which nevertheless is a very interesting science park. Cambridge Science Park, also a very well-established science park, but less well known. So somehow we are lagging behind in Europe. And what I would like to do this morning is to try to give some hints how to bridge the gap so that we could come up with a more dedicated and focused policy. And I just give you an example from my own country, the Netherlands, small as it is. We have 13 universities and we have 13 science parks. Each university creates its own science park, but at the scale of a country, that is too little. It's not a critical mass. Somehow we have to get a change in our mindset. And from that perspective, the notion of clusters is an important notion. Because it's some sort of an integrated framework for putting together knowledge, scientific research, R&D in the public sector, in the private sector. And we might need also some sort of a public support. On the other hand, we also know from other experiences that it is very difficult to plan top-down a cluster. A cluster is something like a mushroom. It can emerge, it needs a seed bed, it needs to be fertilized, but no government can plan an effective and successful cluster, because also based on private initiatives, and if business life doesn't like a cluster, it will not participate. And we have seen many failures of clusters. So that brings me in fact to the point which I would like to discuss with you. This is well known as the triple helix phenomenon, how to integrate the industry here, how to the university here, the industry here, and the government can create some sort of a magical triangle so that we can be more successful. That also means that we need to get rid of ivory towers of science. That is not the way you can create a triple helix. Of course, you need sometimes curiosity-driven young people and research, because you need to have new knowledge. But also, on various occasions, you need to have problem-oriented or applied research. And in many cases nowadays, certainly in our age of innovation, you also have to reinforce the innovative attitude of the research. So there is a whole series of challenges which ought to be addressed. Now, in the literature, in fact, we could make some sort of a systematic classification. And this matrix, which I've put up here, is known as the Pasteur diagram. And the Pasteur diagram essentially makes a typology along two axes. There is the understanding of the world, and there is the applicability. Now, this has 2 by 2 is 4 quadrants. And you can make a systematic, stylized typology of the different forces at work. First, you may have what is called here the Einstein model. The Einstein model has a high understanding of our world, but not necessarily oriented toward application. Einstein was a typical blue sky researcher. He did beautiful things. One of the most successful scientists from the last century. He was not very much interested in applicability, but he wanted to understand the world, and he was successful. So there's the Einstein quadrant. We also have the Pasteur quadrant. Pasteur, also in the field of what we nowadays might call biotechnology. In fact, he was one of the leading persons. He wanted to do fundamental research, but he wanted to help the people. Applicability. So that's where fundamental blue sky research and applicability, in fact, went hand in hand. We also have another type of research orientation, which is the Edison model. Edison invented the light bulb. He said, well, the light bulb is a light bulb, is an invention, a great invention, very applicable. We don't need new knowledge anymore because the light bulb is the light bulb. It will be with us forever. And he was right, but the innovation was a little bit missing, of course. And here, of course, at the very end, you have the standard type of research, which is fine, but does not lead to a jump in the performance, the scientific and technological performance of our world. In the history, and now I give you a 5-minute exposition, and then it will be more on the practical side, but this is an academic atmosphere, so I'm allowed to give also a little bit of an academic exposition. In the literature, this has led to a whole range of contributions for more than 1 century on how to guarantee a successful application of knowledge. And it started already, in fact, with an important question, and that is known in the literature, and it's still a dilemma, the dilemma between polarization and agglomeration. polarization is essentially an economic concept. It says some countries can be very good if they polarize in certain sectors, like aircraft or maybe medical technology. It doesn't say where, it only says a country, the economy. If you would identify the economy, you can ensure that a certain country has an economy which is dominated by certain successful sectors, without saying where. So it's only the economic orientation. Some people even call this clusters. Others would say, well, but we have to know where we find successful industries. That, in fact, is called agglomeration. That's the geography. And sometimes these concepts are mixed. I give you one example from my own country. When Michael Porter was talking about clusters, he said the Netherlands has a few clusters. One important cluster is the flower cluster, horticulture. That is true. But that is a cluster which does not have one location. You find it all over the country. So it has an economic meaning, in fact polarization, but in certain dedicated places you find specific types of horticulture. So that's where, talking about clusters, we always have to look into the general economic perspective. Where are you good at? That's a matter of international trade. That's good old David Ricardo and Heckscher Olin from Sweden and many others who have worked on specialization in international trade. Where are you good at? And produce at least those things at which you are very good. So this is a basic lesson, of course. That's what the EU nowadays calls smart specialization. That's the EU jargon. But at the same time, you cannot be good in every place at the same time and to the same extent. So there is also a need for smart geographical specialization. And these two forces, sometimes in the literature, they are mixed up, sometimes they're confused. And very quickly, for instance, I give you, there's a long list and there's a whole paper behind it, doesn't matter, but there's, just for the sake of clarification, it started already with good old Marshall. Good old Marshall more than 100 years ago, talking about industrial districts. He saw after the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom, he saw the clustering of major industries like coal mining industries and steel industries. And he said, well, this is a specialization. We call this industrial districts. And sometimes they were located around the major industrial centers and cities like Birmingham, etc., Manchester. And he said, well, this is based on scale advantages. The higher the plant, the more profitable you can be because you do it better because of scale advantage. You cannot have small scale coal mining plants or steel plants. You need big things, scale advantage. It's one important motive for a cluster. Later on, especially in the post-war period, after Europe had to recover from the war, we said, well, where do we start? Everything has to be built up, but you cannot build up everything at the same time. So that's where the notion came up of what then was called growth poles and growth centers. Growth poles related to polarization were especially those economic sectors of which you felt, or a country felt, we should invest in it. This could be shipbuilding, it could be textile, it could be anything. The growth centers then, that was also a long debate in Europe, in Spain and Italy and other countries, where do we locate all these activities? So again, it's the dilemma between polarization and agglomeration. At the same time, on the US side of the world, there has been a lot of interest in what by then was called industrial complexes, like the big oil refinery complex in Puerto Rico, etc., where everything was clustered around oil, and more industries attached to it, so you got big industrial clusters, and Europe still has these remainings. The Ruhr area in Germany was built as an industrial complex around coal and steel, etc. Then others would say, well, we also have development axis, and that means that You cannot put everything in one and the same place, but we create corridors of development and everything is linked to each other. A simple example, 30 years ago, the airport of Stockholm, Arlanda Airport, was built. That was 40 minutes driving out of the city center. Everyone said, disaster. But nowadays, if you go from the airport to the city center, it is one development corridor, high-tech corridor. So the airport has created a new development impetus. High-tech, knowledge-driven development, right? Others nowadays, that's more recent, have said, well, there's the French school, André Torre and others, they have said, well, if you build up new knowledge which has to be applied, look at what they call proximity. Not at the distance is negative, proximity is positive. You can have physical proximity, but also social proximity, cognitive proximity. You can easily work together with other people, and students work together all the time. That is cognitive proximity. You use your brains to connect yourself to someone else, etc. And this has become an important new type of approach, especially in the French planning system. Others have said, well, we have to apply knowledge in the region. The region is the anchor point for regional development based on knowledge. And that's also where in various situations in Poland I have observed that also the Marshall Office is somehow integrating the knowledge, the local knowledge, together with the local industries, etc. So that's a perfect example of how it could lead to what then is called regional innovation systems. Of course, regions are never static. They are learning animals. Regions learn. If they don't learn, they lose. So they have to upscale their knowledge and improve their knowledge and get linked not only internally but also externally, because there is no region in Europe anymore living on an island. Any region in Europe is as open as it can be, and I've seen several regions in Poland. Sometimes they produce for the home market, sometimes they produce for the international market. They are more internationally oriented than we often think. The number of linkages international between entrepreneurs in regions is formidable. You don't know how many people fly out of the region all over the world to sell their products. It's always amazing if you see this, but we do not have all this information. But certainly it happens. You have to be the best in knowledge and innovation. There's also this new notion of affective clusters, regions as creative and cognitive engines based on social capital. And our friend Zbigniew Bochniarz has written extensively on this whole notion, which also is nowadays applied to the Polish aviation cluster in Gniezno. I'm just quickly, because I know given the delay, the time is scarce, so what I would like to do now is the following. I would like to illustrate some of these arguments which I've made now on the basis of some sort of an effective cluster thinking in the Netherlands. I would not necessarily say that we have the solution, but I would like to clarify some of the issues. And then maybe you can have a discussion later on how we can handle this and what are the lessons which we might draw for also Poland. From a conceptual perspective, of course, as I said before, regions are open systems, open cognitive systems where universities, industry and local, regional, sometimes national governments play a very important role. They have to work together in this magical triangle. And apart from the conceptualization, what does it mean to have agglomeration advantages, etc., I would like to go immediately to a practical application. And I just give you a 1-minute introduction to the geography of the Netherlands. So here is this very small country, the Netherlands, surrounded by water all the time. This is the German side, this is the Belgian side. As part of regional development policy in the 1970s, 80s, especially the peripheral parts, and this is all peripheral for the Netherlands. Nowadays we say, well, a small country has no periphery. Mind you, proximity is an important issue. Even 100 kilometers in a small country can already make that you are peripheral, right? So when in the 1980s the textile industry went down because we and no European country could compete anymore. We were taken over by Taiwan and by Singapore and sometimes Middle East, Egypt, etc. Much cheaper standard textile product. No one could compete. The textile industry went bankrupt. So huge unemployment here in this part of the country because this was the textile center of the Netherlands. The government said, well, we have to do something. And they had a very important, smart foresight idea. Let's create a new University of Technology as a compensation for the loss of textile, which was a courageous decision, expensive, and no one trusted it very much because there was no academic atmosphere here. This was a university in nowhere, a cathedral in the desert, right? But nowadays, many of you will know this university as the University of Twente. It's a well-known, established, high-quality university, and it's still rapidly increasing in terms of prestige and also in terms of scientific performance. There is another university, which is Nijmegen University, again very close to the German border, it's only 20 kilometers from the German border. That's an old established Catholic university, rather traditional, but has been upskilled in the past years very much. There's a third university, Wageningen University, which is an agricultural university, a small-scale university, not that big, but it's one of the best agricultural universities in the world, because the Netherlands, as you may know, has a big interest in the agricultural sector, in particular in the more advanced parts of agriculture. So here we have an interesting question. We have three rather successful university clusters. And what has happened in the past, each of these clusters has worked for its own. This University of Technology in Twente said, well, we'll try to be successful and become a world leader in certain segments. Radboud University in Nijmegen said, we also want to, that's a totally different type of university, we want to become a specialist certainly in medical science and medical technology. And this university said, Wageningen, agriculture, we want to be world specialists in life sciences, not only agriculture, but also food and health sciences and so on. All different missions, all of them competing, not only with themselves, but also with the rest of the world. And then the question is this a good strategy? And I would not say it was a wrong strategy. No, it has become a rather successful strategy. But even a successful strategy, and the Vice Rector certainly will know this, even a successful strategy does not mean that you can lean back. There is never a comfort zone for any university. University nowadays is a business. And any business always has to look for something better. Even when you are successful, there's always something better. So this is the main lesson. So what happened, first they started with their own image building, branding. So this was called the University of Wageningen, the Agricultural University, the Food Valley. Then the University of Nijmegen, the Health Valley, that was more the medical science. And this university said we are technological valley, a little bit imitating Silicon Valley. It doesn't matter, they had all their own profiles and everything was clustered around their own profile. And rather successful. I mean, the number of spin-offs in terms of new firms created by this knowledge cluster of each individual university was very high. Hundreds of new things. And I just give you, in a nutshell, some of these ideas. Here you get the Technological Valley, the University of Twente. So they have attracted quite some multinationals, like Thales, Vredestein, you know this from Formula 1 racing. Grols, you know this, the beer brewery, but very advanced. And Ten Kate, that's a very interesting model, also a learning model, is the only leftover of the former textile industry. The only leftover. Everything was wiped out, bankrupt. Ten Kate said, if we want to survive, we need new knowledge. And we will use the university to build up new textile knowledge. And without a university, we cannot have a future. So what they did, they said, well, we are good in textile, but we cannot compete in terms of making clothes. Everyone can make clothes. That is not a good market. You have to specialize. So what they did, they were specializing in sails for sailing boats. That's also textile. But mind you, if you are I'm not a good sailor, but if you are in an international sailing boat championship, the shape of the sail, the material of the sail is decisive for your performance. So this is a very high technology activity. And they said we will specialize in them. Nowadays almost all world championships on sailing boats use sails made by this company. And then they specialize in other things. For instance, speaking of might know this, nowadays if you are in an airplane, the door between the cockpit and the passenger compartment has to be locked. In the past, you could, as a passenger, could even look into the panel of the airplane. Nowadays, it's completely locked because of terrorism. But if you have an iron door, very heavy, it's the weight of 1 or 2 passengers, you cannot shoot through the door, but it's very heavy. It's too heavy. They have built light doors, only 10 kilos. Based on textile, but you can never shoot through that door, and it's being used all over the world in most airplanes. Nowadays, if you are a police agent and you need a safety jacket, in the past, like the medieval past, it was made out of iron. Well, you could hardly walk, and if you're on a horse and if you fell down, you could never get on the horse again. Nowadays, it's very light, but you can never shoot through it. So this is new type of technological material where all the sophisticated knowledge of a university has been used. So we have many of these examples. So this is in fact where this university was specialized. That's the size of the university, 20,000 students, the public R&D expenditures, the strength and the weaknesses, etc. In the interest of time I will just quickly go through the next one. That is the Health Valley, that's the University of Nijmegen, based on medical science, and there again, NXP, for instance, Merck and others. It's a bigger university, 45,000, of course, more public expenditure, strength and weakness, etc. So you get sort of a comparison of the different knowledge clusters in 3 regions in the Netherlands. Food Valley, that is the agricultural university. Again, linked and specialized in advanced agricultural products, also successful in attracting some of the major multinationals in this field. This is Campina, that's one of the bigger multinationals in terms of dairy products. Danone, it's a French company, but a leading company in France. Every supermarket in France will sell you Danone yogurt, etc. And so they have established also as a major investment in this area. The number of students, of course, is much lower, but they are able to attract quite some public investment, and of course there are certain strengths and weaknesses in this whole area. The challenge now is the following. If you are successful, should you lean back, or would you say, but there's always a better future? And then the question came up, what would happen if you would link the 3 universities, and not only the universities, including all the private spin-offs, with thousands of employees. If you would make it a cluster at a distance of some 60, 70 kilometers, so it's some distance, but if you would make it a cluster, so you have a cluster first around one university, but you could make it a super cluster, combining 3 clusters and make it one super cluster. Why not? And this has been a major issue and discussion in the Netherlands. But mind you, it will never be done it can never be done in a top-down way. If the minister would say, well, those shall compulsory work together. We have seen some of these examples in Denmark where universities were merged. It was not too successful. They have just done an assessment exercise in Denmark. Not a failure, but not very successful. Stalinistic planning does not work for a university system, right? So you have to first find out, is there already some sort of a cooperation? If there is no cooperation, it's more difficult. If there is already some cooperation, it's better. So what you find here is what kind of bilateral cooperative things are there. For instance, between the one university, Twente and Nijmegen, between Wageningen and Nijmegen, between Twente and Wageningen. So you can just map it out. And is there an increasing trend of bilateral cooperation over the years? If so, you know, you can just follow the trend. You can support the trend, reinforce the trend, but go against the trend, that is always a very difficult thing, right? So this is the type of research you have to do. You have to the fact-finding. What are each of these universities doing, and also in terms of patents, in terms of patent publications, and what kind of other publications, and what kind of research publications, private and public, in which field. So you get a whole map of possible cooperation fields between each of the faculties and each of the research centers, etc., of all the three universities. And then you can make up your mind. Is it worthwhile if we combine our efforts on a voluntary basis? But that would have to lead to a win-win situation. If there's a win-win situation for all players involved, then certainly it would be worth the effort. But nevertheless, it cannot be done in a top-down fashion. It has to be based on voluntary cooperative acts. The model then, which has been used to analyze the potential of cooperation, is in fact called what is called the TPN model, Techno-Policy Network Model. And it more or less, I'm not going, given the lack of time now, but it maps out the different forces through which clusters could cooperate in a supercluster. And you have to map out all these forces, get information on all these items, and then see what will happen if everyone goes for his own sake, or if you would combine the two or three things, how far can you jump in that case? And if the jump is significant, then of course it's easier to go for a cooperative model. So this is in fact the institutional cooperative model in a nutshell, which would have to be looked at in terms of talents, in terms of R&D endowments, in terms of investment systems, including venture capital, etc. And of course, not to forget the entrepreneurship infrastructure. So it's a long-range issue which cannot be solved overnight, but certainly has quite some potential. So what we try to do is to map out, after all the information collection, to map out in a systematic, simple form, in some sort of a spider model, the different criteria, the different angles to be investigated, like private investment funds, public investment funds, talent, private R&D, etc. And for each of the three actors involved, different colors, etc., map them out and see where their strong points are and where their weak points are. And if you would merge them, then you would get the purple color here, the triangle. And if the triangle is for some of these actors very good, better than their own performance, there is of course an inbuilt stimulus for further cooperation. And that's of course, just like the European Union, it's a matter of trading off the autonomy of a cluster or of a university vis-à-vis giving up some of your powers to a higher power, but you can do better. I mean, this is the principle of the European Union, and that's also, in fact, the principle of this type of voluntary cluster action. Now, what we also did was then to look into the question, what is the external environment? Because even a supercluster is still working in a global environment. Science is global. There's nothing local on science, hardly anything local. Science is international. Look into clusters in the area, which are the direct competitors. Well, here, this was the red one was the cluster I discussed. There's also a big cluster in another province in the southern part of North Brabant, which is mainly driven by Philips microelectronics. So that's a huge cluster, of course, but it's mainly specializing in microelectronics. But also, now it comes increasingly in medical technology. Some of you may have seen last week the news from Philips. Philips might stop producing bulbs, or they will still sell bulbs, but they will just outsource it. Bulbs, everyone can produce bulbs. Everyone can produce nowadays television sets. They will still sell them under their name, but completely outsource it. And most likely, the main activity of Philips Microelectronics will be medical technology. That's where the money is. Because everyone is getting older, we go to an aging society, we need more sophisticated medical technology. They found out that the price elasticity of bulbs is rather high, but the price elasticity for medical technology, an MRI scan for instance, if you are ill, you want to have an MRI scan, you don't care about the money, you want to have the scan. So that's where the money is, right? So this, of course, is another significant competitor. Then you have here the Brussels and Louvain cluster in Flanders, which is also a big international cluster of nanotechnology, etc. So you have to look into the broader setting. That means it's essentially that you go from clusters to superclusters, you compare the superclusters with other superclusters, and then you have the whole force field investigated. That's more or less the type of approach which has been adopted. And again, what you do, you can go even a step further, because we also looked into the question, are there other clusters further in Europe? And we looked into the Öresund cluster, which is in fact is the combined Danish-Swedish cluster. That's Copenhagen and Malmö, etc., Lund. So that's given the new connection between the road connection, rail connection between Sweden and Denmark, so that becomes increasingly one uniform cluster. So any policy developed by universities in Europe, in fact, is increasingly determined by the external environment. And there is no hope that the university can resort to some sort of an island of isolation. That is no longer true if a university sees it as its message to transfer the knowledge through the staff, through the research, through the students, to the rest of society. If so, by definition, you become immediately an open system. So we have looked into all the indicators there on the slide, so I'm not going to discuss them in too much detail at this moment. So what you can do is do the same type of analysis, not only for the three clusters which I discussed before, but also the international benchmark analysis looking into mega clusters further in Europe. So this is the type of strategic thinking which we have tried to develop. Now, in the interest of time, I think I'll try to come to an end. Where are we at this moment? It's just in the inventory stage. And of course, the boards of universities have to discuss how far can you go in giving up some of your autonomy in favor of a better performance. At the same time, the regions involved are important, because the regions have to provide, out of public interest and also public money, of course, some of the stimuli and seed money to make this possible. And of course, industry is an uncertain factor, because industry does not sign easily, I agree and I will stay forever. Industry nowadays is volatile. There is no guarantee of any industry that it will stay in the region. Nowadays we have many what we call footloose firms, especially in the high-tech sector, in the knowledge-driven sector. Overnight you can change the location. If you get a better offer from another country or another region, you move. So one of the bigger challenges in public policy and university policy is that you might invest in the region to attract and to keep an industry, but there is no guarantee the industry will be with you forever. It might change overnight, given the international change which we observe. So there is a major risk element in public, proactive public policy. And these are some of the issues which are now heavily discussed in the Netherlands. Can we give some sort of a guarantee? You would like to avoid a failure of the use of public funds, etc. But there is one common agreement that in the future there is no hope for an isolated university. nor for an isolated university cluster. It ought to be open, and somehow in the public domain we have to learn more to deal with uncertainty. Any public investment should have revenues, as we know, otherwise you would not do it. But there is never a guarantee. And that means that even though I believe sometimes in cost-benefit analysis, also at the regional level, somehow in terms of regional and knowledge policy, that ought to be a proactive politician who has the courage to develop concepts, because industry is also driven by new concepts and not by being located in a comfortable comfort zone. So there will be a whole range of challenges for the future, and sometimes I feel that our universities, especially in Europe, are not yet proactive enough. To give an example, and I just make a challenging remark to the vice director, but I'm pretty sure that if I'm, let's say, an entrepreneur, and I would have a splendid idea on, let's say, a new application of nanotechnology for Formula One racing, right? And if I have this idea, and I would like to make some sort of a financial analysis, what's the market of this application in Formula One racing? If I enter the building here and ask the concierge, can you suggest me the name of a good economist or a manager in this academy who can help me? I'm pretty sure the concierge will say, I have no idea what you are talking about. That happens in our university, and I guess that happens in many universities. So the link between industry and university and knowledge transfer is still very weak. Some universities nowadays have built up a TTO system, so technological transfer office system, so that at least there is an entry gate. You know where to address your question. But I still feel that our universities are not yet sufficiently equipped to build up strong relationships between industries and knowledge transfer. And that's a pity, because it's a missed chance. I feel that in other countries sometimes this is better established. Also, if the culture is more entrepreneurial oriented, it's easier, of course, to get the right links. But many of our initiatives sometimes, they just fail. The ideas are good, but who can handle these ideas? So I feel that in terms of policy for universities, but also on the public sector, local and regional side, there is still quite some scope for improvement. On the good side, I've been many times in Poland in the past years. I feel sometimes almost half Polish, but I've been many times in Poland. I'm really impressed by the booming interest in Poland in creating new knowledge. And the university system in Poland is absolutely up to very high standards, there's no question. But I still feel that in terms of not only knowledge transfer, but knowledge interaction and demand articulation, there is still quite some scope for further improvement. And well, I wish you all the best in making this a success. Thank you very much.